Human walked an alien girl through the snow line. Her gentle thanks at the ridge stayed with him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jason Wood, a seasoned traveler from Earth, found himself on a journey far different from any he had anticipated. His mission was simple: transport supplies through the frozen mountains of the far north, a region notorious for its unpredictable weather and biting cold. Jason's gear was state-of-the-art, designed to withstand temperatures well below freezing, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. As he trekked through the snow, the icy wind howled around him, the chill seeping through his layers of protective clothing. His breath came in steady puffs, turning to mist in the cold air. The snow, untouched and pristine, stretched out endlessly in front of him, creating a seemingly infinite white landscape. Yet, amid this harsh environment, Jason noticed a figure in the distance, a figure struggling against the winds, barely visible against the snow. It was an alien, a young woman, stumbling through the blizzard. She looked lost, her movements slow and labored, as if every step cost her more than the last. Jason's instincts kicked in immediately. His training told him to keep his distance, to continue his mission without distractions, but something about the sight of this alien girl struggling in the snow tugged at his heart. He had seen plenty of strange things in his travels, but this felt different. He knew he couldn't just walk past her. Despite the cold and the exhaustion creeping into his muscles, he made his way toward her, every step a fight against the wind. The closer he got, the more clearly he could see her, her delicate features, her pale green skin, and the shimmering light of her silver hair flapping wildly around her face. She was no taller than a human, but the way she moved made it clear that she was struggling, far more than he ever could have imagined. As he reached her, she looked up, startled, her large, dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Jason smiled warmly, trying to put her at ease. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice muffled by the wind. The alien girl hesitated, then nodded slowly, though it was clear she was struggling to stay upright. Without a word, Jason gently helped her to her feet, steadying her with his arms. "Come on," he said softly. "I'll get you through this." Her body was frail, almost fragile, against the harsh cold, and she was clearly not accustomed to such brutal conditions. As Jason helped her, she leaned against him, her steps becoming more stable with each one. They moved through the snow together, the storm around them only growing more intense. For hours, they trekked through the cold, Jason's muscles screaming with the effort of carrying both their weight through the deep snow. But he didn't mind. Every step, every effort, was worth it to see the alien girl make it through this, to ensure that she wouldn't fall victim to the cold. Eventually, they reached a ridge, a small rise in the otherwise endless expanse of snow. They were out of the worst of the storm now, and the wind had died down. Jason paused for a moment, catching his breath. The alien girl, still holding on to him, looked up at the sky. Her eyes, filled with gratitude, met his for the first time since their silent journey began. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but sincere. "You saved me." The words, though simple, carried with them a weight of emotion that Jason couldn't ignore. He had done what anyone would have done, but hearing her say it made the effort feel all the more meaningful. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, watching the fading light of the storm as the last of the clouds cleared from the sky. The silence between them was comfortable, a quiet understanding passing between the two of them. Jason smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature around him. He had helped someone in need, and in return, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. And as they stood there together on that ridge, the gentle thanks of the alien girl stayed with him, reminding him that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the most profound connections. I would be lying if I said Jason didn't feel a sense of accomplishment as he watched the storm die down behind them. They had made it to a ridge, far from the worst of the blizzard. But even as he caught his breath, Jason couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he wasn't quite done. He had brought the alien girl, Leora, as she had introduced herself, through the worst of the snow, but something about her quiet gratitude tugged at him. He had helped, yes, but it was clear now that she wasn't just some stranger passing through. There was something deeper in her eyes, something that hinted at a story, an untold history. As they stood there in the calm after the storm, Jason finally broke the silence. So, Leora, where exactly are you from? Her gaze shifted from the horizon to meet his eyes, the shimmering glow of her silver hair dancing in the soft breeze. She hesitated, as though considering whether to share. I'm from a planet called Talira, she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. It's far from here, beyond the nebula star cluster. My people, well, we don't often venture out. Our world is isolated. Jason nodded, processing her words. He had never heard of Talira, but then again, there were countless planets out there, many of them undiscovered. Is that why you're here? He asked. To see the outside world? Leora shook her head, her eyes lowering as she sighed softly. No, she said quietly. I was exiled. Jason blinked, the weight of her words settling between them. Exiled? He repeated, surprised. Why? She glanced up, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of sadness, quickly masked by a veil of indifference. It's complicated, she said, almost apologetically. But it's not something I wish to discuss now. I'm grateful for your help, Jason. You've saved me from the storm, and for that, I am forever in your debt. Jason looked at her, his curiosity piqued, but he didn't push further. He could sense there was more to her story, but now wasn't the time. It's nothing, he said with a smile. Just doing what anyone would do. Leora seemed to consider his words for a moment, then nodded. You're different, she said suddenly, catching Jason off guard. Most others would have passed me by, but you stopped. You helped without a second thought. Jason shrugged, feeling an uncomfortable heat rise in his cheeks. I guess I just don't leave people behind, he muttered, unsure how else to respond. I can see that, Leora said, her tone soft. It's a rare quality. She looked away, her gaze once again drawn to the open expanse of snow ahead. The silence between them stretched for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes without needing words. Jason glanced at Leora, still trying to make sense of their situation. She wasn't just a stranded traveler, he realized. She was something more, someone who had been through a lot and was carrying more weight than he could imagine. But for now, all he could do was offer her a safe place, a bit of warmth in the cold, and hope that, in time, she would trust him enough to share her story. As the wind picked up again, Jason motioned toward the nearby shelter, a rocky outcrop he had spotted earlier that might offer some protection from the elements. Let's get you somewhere warmer, he said, his voice firm but kind. Leora's eyes met his once more, and for the first time, she gave him a small, genuine smile. Thank you, she said simply, and Jason knew that despite everything, this was just the beginning of their journey together. As Jason and Leora reached the rocky outcrop, they were finally shielded from the worst of the wind. The snow had slowed to a gentle flurry, and the oppressive cold seemed to ease, though not by much. Jason glanced around, assessing the shelter. It wasn't much, just a small natural alcove in the rock, barely large enough for both of them to sit comfortably. But it was enough to keep them out of the worst of the storm. This will do for now, Jason said as he helped Leora settle down, ensuring she was tucked against the rock face for some warmth. He quickly took off his jacket and spread it over her shoulders, though it wasn't much of a shield against the cold. I'll get a fire started. He moved quickly, gathering dry twigs and branches. The storm had soaked the ground, but he managed to find enough debris to start a small fire. After a few attempts, the flame took, and he leaned back on his heels, letting the warmth begin to spread through the shelter. Leora sat silently, her eyes closed for a moment, as if absorbing the warmth. You're exhausted, Jason said, noticing how she was shivering slightly, even now that she was out of the wind. Leora opened her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze. I'll be fine, she said softly, though her voice was tinged with weariness. It's just, this world is colder than I imagined. Jason nodded, understanding. It's not easy, especially for someone not used to it. He sat down next to her, close enough that the firelight flickered on their faces. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft wind outside. Jason wasn't sure why he had offered to help Leora. He had done it without thinking, without expecting anything in return. Maybe it was just the way she looked, lost, vulnerable in a world that was so unfamiliar to her. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. Leora, Jason said after a while, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to face him, her eyes soft, but full of mystery. I don't know what happened to you, or why you ended up out here. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Leora looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching, as if trying to read something in his expression. Finally, she nodded. I know, she said, her voice gentle. I appreciate your kindness. Not many would do what you've done for me. Jason smiled slightly. It's just who I am. I don't leave people behind. Leora's gaze softened at that, and she seemed to relax just a little. For the first time since they had met, she leaned back against the rock, closing her eyes. Jason watched her for a while, the firelight dancing in her features. He had seen many things in his life, but helping Leora felt different. It wasn't about duty or obligation. It was about something much simpler, doing what was right. Eventually, Jason settled beside her, the warmth from the fire and their proximity enough to make the cold night bearable. We'll be all right, he murmured, though it was as much for himself as it was for her. Leora's eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a small, faint smile. Thank you, she whispered again, her voice quiet but sincere. Jason nodded, settling in for the night. It wasn't the journey he had expected, but as he lay back against the rock, he realized it was one he was glad to be a part of. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the icy landscape. Jason woke early, as usual, to check on the fire. The warmth from the night before had faded, but the air was still bitterly cold. He rubbed his eyes, stretched his stiff limbs, and got to his feet, the crunch of snow beneath him breaking the stillness. Leora was still sleeping, her breathing steady and calm. Jason couldn't help but admire how peaceful she looked, despite everything she had been through. He had never expected a journey like this, but here he was, sharing his space with someone from another world, someone who had a story of her own. He hadn't pushed her to share it, not yet. He knew that the time would come when she would trust him enough. For now, they had their silence, and that was enough. After tending to the fire, Jason moved toward the entrance of the alcove, his boots leaving prints in the snow. He took a deep breath, feeling the crispness of the morning air fill his lungs. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after a storm had passed. Everything was still. The wind had died down, and even the snow seemed to be holding its breath, as though waiting for something. He turned back to the shelter, where Leora was now stirring. Her eyes opened slowly, and she sat up, wrapping herself in the warmth of his jacket. Jason smiled and walked over. Morning, he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up at him and nodded. Morning, she replied, her voice still a little rough from sleep. There was a moment of hesitation, but then she spoke again. I'm sorry for being such a burden. I know you didn't sign up for this. Jason raised his hand to stop her. You're not a burden, Leora, he said firmly. We're in this together. That's all that matters. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, she seemed to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing. I'm not used to people being so kind, she said quietly. Where I come from, kindness is rare. It's something that has to be earned. Jason frowned, confused. What do you mean? Kindness is something everyone deserves. Leora shook her head slowly, as if trying to explain something that was too complicated for words. Not where I'm from, she said softly. My people, we're taught to be strong, to rely on ourselves. The idea of accepting help, of being vulnerable, is seen as weakness. Jason felt a pang of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine living in a place where vulnerability was punished, where kindness was scarce. He took a step closer and sat down beside her. You don't have to worry about that here, he said. On Earth, we help each other because it's the right thing to do. You don't have to earn it. It's just what we do. Leora turned to look at him, and for a moment, Jason saw something flicker in her eyes, something fragile, something hopeful. I've never heard anyone say that before, she whispered. Jason smiled, the warmth of his own words surprising him. Well, now you've heard it. He paused, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. You're not alone, Leora. You never have to be. Leora's gaze softened, and she looked down at the fire for a long time. Jason didn't push her to speak. Instead, he sat with her in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the air between them. Slowly, the sky brightened, the light of the sun spreading across the horizon. Jason stood up and stretched, glancing back at Leora. We should get moving soon, he said, his voice gentle. Leora nodded, the weight of their journey still ahead of them. But in that moment, Jason realized something. Despite everything, the cold, the hardship, the unknowns, this journey had already changed him. He wasn't just helping Leora survive the snow. He was learning something about kindness, about the simple strength that came from offering help without expecting anything in return. As they packed up and prepared to leave the shelter, Jason looked back one last time at the fire. The warmth had faded, but it had done its job. It had brought them through the night, and now, it was time to move forward. With Leora by his side, Jason felt ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer just two strangers in a frozen world. They were a team, and together, they could face anything. As Jason and Leora continued their journey through the snow, the landscape around them slowly began to change. The rolling hills of icy terrain started to flatten out, and the jagged peaks that had loomed so closely in the distance were now far behind them. The storm had finally passed, but the air still held a biting chill, and the ground remained solid with layers of thick snow. Every step they took left a mark, a small sign that they had moved forward, even though it felt as though they were still trapped in the same frozen world. They had been traveling for hours, the distance between them and their destination growing. Yet the silence between them was comfortable. Leora seemed quieter than usual, her steps slower, her gaze more distant. Jason had been keeping an eye on her, knowing that the journey was beginning to take its toll. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking, what memories were drifting through her mind. How much farther? Leora asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity in it, as though she was trying to gauge how much longer they would need to keep moving. Jason glanced over at her, his breath coming out in visible puffs in the cold air. We're getting closer, he said, his tone reassuring, though he wasn't entirely sure. The snow was dense here, and their path was getting harder to track. He knew that they couldn't stop now. They needed to keep moving if they were to make it to safety before nightfall. Leora nodded, but her gaze remained focused ahead, lost in thought. Jason could see the slight tension in her posture, the way she was still holding herself back, not fully at ease. He didn't know what she was running from, or what had brought her out into the cold in the first place. She hadn't spoken much about her past, and Jason hadn't pushed. But today, something felt different. There was an edge to her silence now, a depth that hadn't been there before. Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of it. Leora, he said after a moment, his voice steady. She looked up at him, her eyes bright but wary. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, but if you ever want to talk about what happened, I'm here. She didn't respond immediately, but Jason could see the flicker of emotion that crossed her face. She seemed to be weighing his words, searching for the right way to answer. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. It's not that I don't want to talk, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to begin. Jason gave her a small smile, trying to offer her some comfort. You don't have to start anywhere. You don't owe me an explanation. But when you're ready, I'll listen. Leora met his gaze for a moment, and Jason could see the gratitude in her eyes, even if she didn't fully express it. She nodded slowly, but the quiet weight between them didn't lift. They continued walking in silence, the crunch of their boots in the snow the only sound between them. Jason had to admit that, despite the calm he had been trying to offer her, he wasn't entirely sure how much further he could keep up this pace. He could see the strain in her eyes, the way she was holding back, as though every step was a battle she was fighting on her own. And yet, despite everything, she still kept going, still walked beside him without faltering. It was then that Jason realized something. No matter how difficult the journey, no matter how far they had to go, Leora wasn't alone anymore. She had someone with her now, someone who cared enough to keep walking with her. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. As they made their way through the snow-covered expanse, Jason kept close to her, his steps matching hers. No matter how much longer this journey would take, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Together, they would face whatever came next. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jason felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, there was something waiting for them on the other side of the snowline. The wind had begun to pick up again, the soft flurries now turning into sharper gusts as Jason and Leora continued their trek. It had been hours since they had left the shelter, and although they were making progress, the snow seemed endless, stretching across the horizon in all directions. Jason glanced over at Leora, who was walking beside him, her pace slower than before. She had pulled her jacket tighter around her, trying to shield herself from the cold, but Jason could see the way her shoulders hunched, the way she winced with each step. She was growing tired, and Jason knew it. He had seen that look before, the way someone tried to push through the exhaustion, pretending they were fine when they were anything but. Jason's own muscles were beginning to ache as well, the weight of the journey settling in, but he didn't want to show it. They had to keep moving. "We should take a break," Jason suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "Just for a little while." Leora shook her head, her eyes focused on the path ahead. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady but lacking the usual strength it had carried before. Jason didn't believe her. "You're not fine," he said, his tone softening. "We've been walking for hours, and you've been through a lot. We'll rest, just for a few minutes." Leora hesitated, then gave a small nod, allowing him to lead her to a small outcrop of rocks on the side of the path. They sat down, the cold stone biting through their clothes, but it was better than standing in the wind. As they settled, Jason pulled out a small thermos from his pack, pouring a bit of warm water into 2 cups. He handed one to Leora, who took it quietly. They sat in silence for a while, each of them focused on the warmth that was slowly returning to their bodies. Jason glanced over at Leora, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them since they had left the shelter. She had been more distant, and though she had expressed gratitude for his help, there was a tension that lingered around her. He could sense that she was holding something back, but he wasn't sure how to reach her. Leora caught him looking at her and gave a small, tired smile. "You're probably wondering why I'm so quiet," she said softly. Jason blinked, surprised. "No," he said honestly. "I mean, I was thinking you might be a little tired, that's all." Leora chuckled lightly, a sound that almost seemed out of place in the desolate landscape around them. "I'm more than just tired," she said, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "I'm afraid." Jason leaned forward, concern flashing in his eyes. "Afraid?" he repeated. "Of what?" She stared at her cup, swirling the water gently in her hands. "I'm not used to relying on others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back home, we're taught to stand on our own, to never show weakness, to never ask for help. But here, I'm not sure what to do. I've never been in a place like this, with someone who cares enough to help me. It's overwhelming." Jason listened carefully, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He understood now, more than ever, the depth of what she had been carrying. It wasn't just the cold or the journey that had worn her down. It was the emotional weight of living in a world that had taught her to shut herself off from others. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Leora," he said softly, "you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to do everything on your own. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face, and for the first time, Jason saw the vulnerability she had been hiding. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, just a little. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible against the wind. "I don't know how to let go, but I'm starting to trust you." Jason gave her a warm smile, offering her the comfort he could provide in that moment. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "We'll take it one step at a time, together." They sat there for a while longer, the quiet of the snow-filled world around them giving space for the moment to settle between them. Jason knew that the road ahead was still long, and that they would face many challenges before they reached safety. But for now, as the storm raged on in the distance, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't expected to find. In such a cold, barren place. He wasn't sure where their journey would take them, but he was certain of one thing. They weren't alone anymore. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change once again. The flat, endless expanse of snow that had surrounded them for what felt like an eternity started to break up. replaced by jagged hills and rocks jutting up from the ground like ancient bones. The air, while still bitterly cold, was beginning to feel more alive, as though they were slowly leaving the heart of the storm behind. Jason could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They had made it through the worst of it, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The trek had taken its toll on both of them, but Leora was moving more steadily now, her steps no longer as tentative as before. There was something about the way she held herself, something about her quiet strength, that made Jason feel a sense of pride. She had come a long way since the first day they had met, when she had been nothing but a fragile figure caught in the snow. Now, she walked beside him with purpose, though he could still see the exhaustion behind her eyes. "How are you holding up?" Jason asked, glancing over at her. Her response came with a small, tired smile. "Better," she said, though her voice still carried the weight of the journey. "But I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this pace." Jason nodded, understanding. He felt the same way. "We can take it slower if you need to," he said, his tone soft. Leora shook her head. "No, I want to keep moving. The longer we stay still, the harder it is to get started again." Jason knew she was right. The snow had already slowed them down enough, and they needed to make as much progress as possible before the next storm hit. "All right," he said, glancing ahead. "We keep moving, but we'll take breaks when we need to." As they continued on, the air grew colder once more, and the wind picked up. Jason could feel the sting against his face, but it didn't seem to bother Leora as much. She had been through worse, he knew that now. They had both endured hardship, but there was a resilience in her that reminded him of why he kept pushing forward. He wasn't just helping her anymore. She was helping him too, more than she could understand. After another hour of walking, the terrain began to level out once again, and Jason's eyes caught sight of something ahead, a cluster of rocks, tall and jagged, like the remnants of some ancient, long-forgotten structure. The shelter it offered was small, but would provide enough protection to rest for the night. Jason pointed toward it. "We'll make camp there," he said, his voice carrying over the howling wind. Leora nodded, and they made their way toward the shelter. When they arrived, Jason immediately set to work gathering what little firewood he could find, though the snow made it difficult. He had learned long ago that even the smallest fire could be a lifeline in places like this. Leora, meanwhile, sat on a large rock, watching him work. Jason could see the way her gaze lingered on the snow, her thoughts distant. He didn't interrupt her. It was clear that, like him, she needed time to think, time to process everything that had happened. Once the fire was crackling and the warmth began to spread, Jason sat down next to her, the quiet crackling of the flames filling the space between them. Leora finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "I used to think I was alone," she said, her eyes still focused on the fire. "That I had to rely on no one but myself. But now, I don't know what to think anymore." Jason turned to face her, his expression soft. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Leora didn't respond immediately, but Jason could see the way her shoulders relaxed, just a little, as though the weight she had been carrying for so long was starting to ease. They sat there together, the warmth from the fire casting flickering shadows against the rocks around them. The wind howled outside, but inside their small shelter, they were safe, if only for a little while. Jason knew their journey was far from over. There was still so much they had to face. But as he sat beside Leora, he realized that whatever came next, they would face it together. They weren't just two travelers lost in the snow anymore. They had become something more, companions, bound by the hardships they had shared, by the trust that was slowly growing between them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jason allowed himself to believe that they might just make it through this after all. The next morning, Jason woke to find the air still cold, but not as biting as it had been the previous days. The fire from the night before had burned down to embers, but it still offered a bit of warmth as he stirred it back to life. He could hear Leora moving behind him, her footsteps light on the snow, and he glanced over to see her standing by the edge of the small shelter, looking out over the vast, snow-covered expanse. "Are you okay?" Jason asked as he stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. Leora turned to look at him, offering a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was a little distant. "Just thinking." Jason nodded, understanding that she had a lot on her mind. She had been through so much, and although she hadn't shared all of her past with him, Jason could sense that the weight of her history was still pressing down on her. They both had their own burdens, but in this moment, they were sharing the same path, moving forward together. "We should get moving," Jason said after a brief pause. "We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. The snow might hold off for a while, but another storm could be coming." Leora nodded again, though Jason could tell she wasn't thrilled about the idea of continuing their journey. She had come so far, and the physical toll was beginning to show. Jason felt the same exhaustion creeping into his own bones, but there was no time to rest. "Not yet. Let's go," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. Leora gave him a small nod and turned toward the path ahead, the crunch of her boots in the snow the only sound in the otherwise quiet world. The journey ahead felt different today. It wasn't just the landscape changing around them or the steady march of time passing. There was something more, an understanding between them. Jason had grown used to Leora's quiet presence, to the way she kept her thoughts to herself, and yet, despite the silence, he felt a deeper connection with her now. They weren't just two strangers thrown together in a world of ice and snow anymore. They were companions, sharing something more than just the physical journey. As they walked, the wind began to pick up again, but it wasn't as harsh as before. Jason kept his eyes on the path, but every so often, he would glance over at Leora. She was walking a little more slowly today, the weight of the journey settling heavier on her shoulders. It didn't take long before they reached another rocky outcrop, this one offering a better view of the valley below. Jason decided it was time for a break, not just for him, but for Leora too. "Let's rest here for a bit," he suggested, motioning toward the rocks. Leora didn't argue. She was tired, and he could see it in the way she moved. Slowly, they both made their way to the rocks, the cold air biting at their faces as they settled down on a flat surface. Jason pulled out his remaining supplies, some dried food and a small canteen of water, and offered it to Leora, who took it gratefully. "I've been meaning to ask," Jason said after a few moments of silence, looking out over the valley. "What's it like, where you come from?" "Talira, I think you said?" Leora paused, clearly taken off guard by the question. She seemed to think about it for a moment before responding. "It's hard to explain," she said quietly. "My people are very different from humans. We live in isolation, on a world that's far from others. We don't interact much with other species. We're taught that our survival depends on our own strength, on our ability to endure without help." Jason nodded, listening carefully. "I can't imagine living like that," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I mean, we all have our struggles, but we rely on each other. It's how we survive. You're not weak for needing help, Leora. Everyone needs someone." Leora looked at him, her eyes softening slightly. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just hard for me to accept that, to let someone else in." Jason gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to let anyone in right away, but when you're ready, I'll be here." The moment hung between them, a quiet understanding growing in the space that had been filled with so much silence before. For the first time, Leora seemed to let her guard down just a little, the smallest of smiles tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than he expected. Jason nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him at her gratitude. "No problem," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get through this, together." They sat there for a while longer, the sun slowly sinking lower in the sky. The fire that had been lit earlier was now a small, dying ember, but the warmth it offered had been enough for the moment. Jason could feel the journey pulling at him again, but this time, it didn't feel quite as heavy. He wasn't walking alone anymore, and somehow, that made all the difference. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and quiet companionship. Jason and Leora had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their journey, their steps in sync as they moved across the snow-covered landscape. The world around them remained vast and unforgiving, but with each passing mile, Jason could sense the change in Leora. She was no longer the fragile traveler she had been when they first met. There was a strength in her now, something he hadn't seen before, and it made him proud. The trust between them had deepened, and with it, the bond they shared. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, a quiet understanding that words couldn't quite capture. Jason knew when Leora needed space, and she, in turn, had started to recognize when he needed a moment of solitude. As they made their way through another stretch of snow-covered hills, Jason noticed the shift in the air. It wasn't just the weather. It was something about the way the landscape had changed. The snow was no longer a heavy, oppressive weight. It had begun to thin, the ground below them turning from thick, frozen crust to something softer, more malleable. The path ahead looked different. "We're almost there," Jason said, his voice breaking the quiet. Leora looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Jason smiled, though it wasn't a full smile. "I can feel it. We've been walking for days. It's just a sense, but I know we're close." Leora didn't respond immediately, but she gave a small nod, her gaze moving from Jason to the path ahead. They continued walking in silence for a while longer, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the stillness. As they approached a rise in the terrain, the distant sound of rushing water reached their ears, the first sign of a river or stream in the distance. Jason's heart lifted. They had made it. The river wasn't far now, and beyond it lay the edge of the mountains, where they would be able to find shelter from the harsh weather. "We're close," Jason repeated, more to himself than to Leora. She didn't need reassurance. She had her own quiet resolve now, something that came from deep within. They were both ready to rest, to find safety after so many days of relentless travel. When they finally reached the river, the sight of the flowing water was almost surreal after the endless expanse of snow. Jason crouched beside the river, dipping his hand into the cool, clear water. It felt refreshing, invigorating even, and he drank deeply. "We can rest here," he said, looking up at Leora. She was standing a few feet away, watching him. There was a calm in her eyes now, a peace that hadn't been there before. She nodded and walked over, sitting down beside him. The two of them sat in the quiet, the sound of the water flowing over rocks a soothing backdrop to the stillness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the landscape, Jason felt a sense of finality settle over him. They had made it through the hardest part of their journey, and now they could finally rest. "Thank you," Leora said, her voice soft but full of meaning. Jason looked over at her, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her gaze steady. "For bringing me this far. For not leaving me behind." Jason didn't know what to say. There was nothing he could say that would capture what he felt in that moment. Instead, he just nodded, his throat tight. They sat there for a long while, the day slowly fading into night. But Jason knew that this was just the beginning. They had come so far together, but there was still more to face. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in days, Jason felt a sense of hope. Not for himself, not entirely, but for both of them. And for the first time, Leora seemed to believe that, too.